Welcome everyone to St. Louis County Library's virtual program, Birds, Bees, Flowers, and Trees, presented by Dr. Desiree Narango as the keynote speaker of the Partners for Native Landscaping webinar series. I'm Sarah Quince-Jones, the Adult Programming Coordinator for St. Louis County Library. And before we get started, I wanted to bring to your attention a few helpful tips in case this is your first Zoom program with us or if it's been a while. First of all, this is a webinar, which means you should be able to see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. We are recording, so this will be available on our YouTube within a few days. The library has a lovely action-packed YouTube channel, and you'll receive an email with a link when we do have that posted with subtitles. We do have subtitles available this evening, live captioning, and you can show or hide those, make them larger or smaller, all through the caption button that you'll see in the Zoom window on your screen. If you do suddenly have any difficulties with your connection, suddenly you can't hear or see us, that's usually bandwidth issues at play. And we recommend that you exit the program, that you move closer to your Wi-Fi router wherever you may be, and you can click the link to rejoin us when you're settled again, and you can come right back to us. So since we're recording, you're not going to miss anything in the long run, and that hopefully will get you everything you need to enjoy tonight's program. We do have the chat turned on so that if you do have any questions, you can put those in the chat. That's the only way we're able to interact with you. So feel free to submit questions or comments as they occur to you. Questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation as we have time. Remember, you don't have to have a library card or even be a resident of St. Louis County to attend our programs, virtual or in person. We hope that you enjoy yourself this evening, you learn something new, and feel free to share it with family and friends. Tonight's program is the keynote of the Partners for Native Landscaping series, webinar series, and we're just getting started. So the partners have a lot going on in the next month and a half, and we have 9 more webinars after tonight, and they also are hosting an in-person workshop and plant sale on April 15th from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. at Powder Valley Conservation Nature Center. I'm going to have a link to more information about Partners for Native Landscaping here in a moment, but I just want to point out that the next couple of programs in the webinar series are Homegrown National Park is Growing Here, presented by Jean Ponzi of Earthway Center of the Missouri Botanical Garden. That's tomorrow, Wednesday, March 8th at 2 p.m. And then Container Gardening with Native Plants, presented by Mervyn Wallace of Missouri Wildflowers Nursery, and that'll be next Tuesday night, March 14th at 7 p.m. And you can find those programs and all of our programs at slcl.org/events to register for any of our online programs. And you can also catch up with any program you miss by checking out the library's YouTube channel. So I'll put links to all of these things in the chat in a moment. I'll also be including a link to a survey to provide the Partners for Native Landscaping with some feedback about today's webinar, and it helps them to plan for next year too. But now I'd love to introduce you to this evening's presenter. Desiree Narango is a conservation scientist at Vermont Center for Eco-Studies. Her research focuses on biodiversity, conservation, and habitat restoration in the face of global change. She primarily studies plants, insects, and birds with a particular focus on multi-trophic interactions, habitat relationships of wildlife with specialized life histories, and mechanistic approaches to applied ecology. Much of Desiree's work takes place in forests of all types, from naturally regenerating and preserved forests to novel ecosystems significantly altered by people, such as urban street trees, residential yards, and agroforestry. As a conservation biologist at VCE, Desiree's ultimate goal is to help land managers and communities implement effective and efficient action to support biodiversity and people in a rapidly changing world. She completed her PhD in entomology and wildlife ecology at the University of Delaware in 2018, an MS in natural resources from the Ohio State University in 2012, and a BS in environmental biology from SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in 2006. Thank you so much for being with us as a part of Partners for Native Landscaping, and we really are thrilled to have you kick this off with your keynote this evening. Over to you, Desiree.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah. That was kind of a mouthful.
It was fun. It was fun to use some words that I might not otherwise use. So thank you for being here.
Well, I appreciate that introduction, and thank you so much for this invitation to speak to everyone tonight. And thank you for tuning in. It's great to see so many people on this call and excited to learn, and hopefully you learned something new tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you see a beautiful cartoon.
Looks great.
Okay, great. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my research program, which involves not just birds, but also bees, the flowers, and the trees, and a lot of it about the research that I've done looking at species interactions in urban ecosystems and particularly in residential yards. And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about what these birds and bees have taught me about how we can cultivate our gardens for conservation through the choices that we make in our landscaping. But before I get started, I just want to say that as a conservation scientist, my job is to help you, is to help people. And so if there's anything that you see in this talk that gets you excited, or you want to learn more, or you just didn't quite catch what I heard, or you have some questions, feel free to reach out to me anytime. You can email me. You can also find me on Twitter. And if you go on my website, all of the papers that I talk about here today and any of the graphics that I share are also available freely as well. So feel free to peruse any of that information. So without further ado, this first slide is going to be the most depressing slide of the night, but I assure you the rest of it will be full of optimism. But if you've been paying attention to the news, you've probably heard some really alarming headlines about the biodiversity declines that are happening around the globe. In fact, scientists are now calling this the sixth mass extinction is currently in process. And we see all around the world alarming declines of all sorts of different kinds of wildlife. From losses of butterflies and grasshoppers and beetles and dragonflies and insects all around the globe, which some folks have started to term the insect apocalypse. We've also seen in the last 50 years, we have 3 billion, that's billion with a B, fewer birds than we used to have a few decades ago. And so this isn't just the loss of species. This is really a shift in what we think is normal. We have lost an abundance and biomass of wildlife all around the world. And it leaves us with the question of, you know, what can we actually do? What can we do to help combat some of these biodiversity declines? There's another decline that's also happening right now that doesn't quite get as much attention, but I would argue is just as serious. And that is the extinction of ecological interactions. And Dan Jansen has this wonderful quote from the 70s that said that this is a much more insidious kind of extinction. And that's because it happens right under your nose and you don't even realize it. We lose interactions between plants and animals, interactions between species, and also interactions between us and nature. We're losing that all the time. So when we think about conservation, we need to think about not just how can we conserve the species, but how we can conserve their interactions with the environment and with us. Because when we lose those interactions, we lose ecosystem function, we lose services, we lose the resilience of the ecosystem, and we accelerate that species loss. But I would argue that if we start to pay attention to these interactions that happen all around us, the wildlife will tell us what we need to do, and we may be able to learn what we need to do to make a difference. And so I would argue that at this point in time, we really can't have successful conservation unless we incorporate privately managed land. And that's really where I come in. So as a research scientist, my specialty is really thinking about conservation solutions for both people and wildlife. And I really think this can make a huge difference, because if we look around the United States, about more than 60% of it is considered privately owned, whether it's a private forest or farm or in private land. And there's some estimates that, at least for the lower 48, that 10 to 20% of that is considered residential areas alone. And so this is a large amount of land that's being converted and could potentially impact wildlife. And I would argue that this is a lot of opportunity in these green spaces where we can start thinking about new conservation solutions. But if we want to really improve these areas for biodiversity, we need to first study them. And then we also need to provide the information that people can then use in their decision making. And so that's what I'm hoping that I can offer you a little bit tonight. I want to really emphasize the important footprint that is residential yards, because even if we think about across the United States, it can be 10 to 20% of the land cover. If we take a finer look into our cities and our towns, we can see that on average, more than 50% of the green space that are in these cities and towns are locked up in privately managed yards. And so that means that the city doesn't have a lot of control over what happens there. And it's kind of a challenge, because if the management is at the hands of all these individual parcel owners, we need to really provide the information that they can use to make decisions at home that also satisfy their needs and values. And so they can make some decisions like this. The typical yard type in the US might be this tidy lawn aesthetic, which is composed of turf lawn with a few trees and shrubs, and you might suspect doesn't support a lot of biodiversity. But alternatively, we can also think about different kinds of land management styles, such as more nature-based or earth positive or sustainable landscaping choices. And there's been a lot of attention and a lot of interest, which is really exciting, about this new era of thinking about how we can share our yard with biodiversity. And it has a lot of potential for contributing to the conservation that we have, especially in these urban and suburban areas. And I can assure you that yards can create conservation success stories. And we don't hear about them very often, but I assure you that they happen. For example, the Atala butterfly was a species of butterfly in Florida that was presumed to be extinct. But then its host plant, the Kunti plant, got really popular in horticulture. And so once people started planting its favorite plant in their yards, suddenly the Atala butterfly came back, and it wasn't actually extinct. And now its populations are more stable than ever before. We also have examples up here in Massachusetts. We have breeding wood thrush in people's yards if they have enough of a shrub layer for these birds to nest in. Down in the South, we can find populations of endangered orchids that are thriving in people's yards. And out in the Midwest, where you all are in Missouri, there are situations where the rusty patch bumblebee has its last strongholds in some very cultivated green spaces like residential yards, as well as some parks and some zoos as well. But we know that not all yards support these species of conservation concerns. So we really need a better understanding of what are the specific features and mechanisms that lead to high quality habitat. And one of the primary ways that people and yourselves are personally manage your land is through the plants that you cultivate. From the trees that got cut down when your neighborhood was developed, the ones that were planted in their place, the designer gardens that we cultivate, how many times we mow, each one of those seemingly small decisions has had the additive effect of completely transforming the plant communities that have survived to occupy the present day. And although we know that that really could have strong cascading implications on the wildlife that are able to use these yards as well, interest in this kind of research is just getting started. So we have a lot more to learn about what we can do to conserve wildlife and their interactions. And so one of the choices that you might be making in your yard is whether to plant native or non-native plant species. And what I mean by non-native can be a plant that does not have a natural distribution that includes your frame of reference. So for some people, a native plant might be one that's native to your county. It could be native to your state. It could be native to the United States. People have different frames of references in their scale. But for the purposes of this talk and for the purposes of my research, most of the definition that I'm using is a very broad definition, which is native to the Eastern United States, where I do my research. So a lot of the plant species that have been introduced through horticulture, these non-native plants, are primarily from other countries that have been imported around the world because of these horticultural preferences for exotic or new or beautiful different species. And this is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and non-native plants are extremely abundant in urban and suburban areas. And so they have the potential to really impact wildlife communities. And the reason for that is because our native species, the native plants that have adapted to our ecosystems, that have natural distributions for your local region, those native plants are the ones that support native food webs. And so now I'm going to share with you a bunch of examples for how our native plants do that. One of the first examples that I'm going to share is with our butterflies and our moths. So while we get the opportunity to see these beautiful jewels of butterflies visiting the flowers in our gardens, what you might not realize is that for those butterflies and moths, they actually spend the majority of their life cycle as plant-eating caterpillars. So the female lays eggs on a leaf, those eggs hatch, they turn into a caterpillar. The caterpillar lives several weeks feeding on those leaves before it pupates, and then it eventually comes out as the beautiful butterfly or the beautiful moth. So a great example of this that we learn about in grade school is the example of the monarch butterfly, which in its caterpillar form feeds exclusively on milkweed plants. So we can't have healthy populations of the monarch butterfly unless we have healthy populations of the native milkweed plants that this butterfly species needs. But truthfully, this specialization that the monarch butterfly has is not an exception. It's actually the norm. And for every single butterfly that you see out there, they are relying on a very specialized interaction with just a few different host plants. So for all of the butterflies that you'd like to see in your yard, you have to also supply the plants that these butterflies need when they're in their caterpillar form. This is a very important specialization that is found across the insect group. In fact, even going beyond butterflies and moths, we know that more than 90% of our plant-eating insects are plant specialists to some degree. And what that means is that over evolutionary time, these caterpillars and other insects have adapted to feed on very specific host plants, that they've overcome those nasty defensive chemical compounds that are found in the leaf. They've also adapted to how that plant looks, or also the timing of that plant as well. So a really great example of this is up in the upper right here is the double-toothed prominent caterpillar. which feeds exclusively on elm trees. So you can't have the double-tooth prominent unless you have elm trees, and you can see that they blend in really nice on the double tooth of the elm leaf as well. But we see this kind of specialization in all kinds of different insects, from our true bugs and our hoppers, our beetles, and even our bees as well. Specialization can also take a couple of different forms. So some insects have very close, tight relationships with just a few different tree or plant species. So a great example of this up here in New England is the rosy maple moth, which is a beautiful pink and yellow moth that I just love seeing in June. But in its caterpillar form, it feeds exclusively on maple trees. And in fact, up here in New England, they have a strong preference for sugar maples. So the more syrup that we make, the more rosy maple moths that we can have. We can also see examples of regional specialization. So an example of this is in the Promethea moth, which is a huge silk moth. It's about the size of a dinner plate or a small dinner plate. And they show a regional specialization where up in New England, our Promethea moths feed almost exclusively on cherries and sassafras trees. If you go down to the mid-Atlantic, however, now Promethea moths have switched to feeding really heavily on tulip trees. And if you go down to the southeastern United States, such as Georgia or Alabama, those Promethea moths are feeding on magnolia trees very heavily. So it really matters where you are in the United States and what trees are most important for these species that exhibit these regional specializations. There's also examples of caterpillars that we would call generalists. So that means that they feed on more than 3 different plant families. And an example of this is the saddled prominent, which is kind of a drab moth, but I just think a glorious caterpillar. And they feed on all kinds of different deciduous trees, such as maples, birches, hickory, chestnut, dogwood, beech, walnut, oak. The list goes on and on and on. So compared to something like the rosy maple moth, this species is quite the generalist. But if we think about all the different plants that are out there and all the ones that we've imported in horticulture and all of the non-native plants that could possibly come in, really, even though this is a generalist caterpillar, it's really just eating a small fraction of the available plant diversity that's out there. All of these plant-eating insects are an incredibly important food resource for a much larger food web. And the next step in that food web is in our communities of other invertebrate consumers. So things like ground beetles on the left and spiders on the right are very important predators that help keep those plant-eating insects down, and it helps to sustain their diverse populations as well. So we need those plant-eating insects to support the consumer insects as well. But the consumer that I really care about is our birds. And insects are incredibly important for supporting our bird populations. In fact, if we look across the globe, more than 95% of our songbirds, so these are things like cardinals and blue jays and chickadees and finches and sparrows, more than 95% of those species require insects at least in some point in the annual cycle. And if we look at the species that eat mostly insects, so more than 50% to 100% of their diet is insects, now we're looking at more than 70% of the songbirds around the globe rely on these insects. It's incredibly important during these key periods of the annual cycle where nutrition is really important for birds. One of those seasonal events where insects are important for a large number of bird species is during the breeding season. And that's because insects are this really amazing, nutritious food resource that helps those baby birds grow. And it really takes a lot of different insects or caterpillars to feed just one nest of baby songbirds. So a great example of this is my favorite bird, the black-capped chickadee. And when they're feeding their young, they're feeding from 390 to 570 caterpillars per day. That's just to raise one little clutch of 6 little baby birds in a nest. And chickadees are feeding their young for 16 days before those little baby birds can leave the nest. So that's thousands and thousands and thousands of caterpillars that it takes just to raise one nest of birds. So we really need to maximize the amount of insect diversity and biomass that's out there so that we can sustain our songbird populations. And these insects are really, I just want to emphasize, they're a superfood for birds. They are doing tremendously more than your bird feeders are. And the reason is because they have high protein, which is important, like I said, for growing baby birds, also for putting on muscle and fat. They have really high calories. They have high antioxidants, which are important for immune function and also to make those beautiful plumages that we like to see, like the cardinal in the snow in the wintertime. And insects also have a really high predictability as well. So birds know what time of year and where to look for these insects. And so it's really a really reliable food resource for them to use throughout the year. So in this way, our bird conservation is really intimately connected to insect conservation. And our insect conservation is built on the foundation of those plant communities that we cultivate. And so those seemingly small decisions like, what kind of tree am I going to plant? Am I going to have a native or a non-native species can have far-reaching implications for the rest of that food web. And so when we actually look at this from a science perspective, when we actually compare the amount of insects that we find on native species that are adapted to our local ecosystems and non-native species that have been imported in, we see that our native species on average support a much higher diversity of insects. They support a much higher diversity of our most specialized insects. So those rosy maple moths that are highly tied or are very strongly tied to specific host plants. And they also support a much higher abundance in biomass. In fact, in some of our studies, we were seeing more than 5 times the number of caterpillar species and 2 to 3 times more caterpillar abundance and biomass. And that abundance in biomass is really what matters from the bird's perspective, because that means lots of food for those baby birds in the nest. The number of species that we see on different native and non-native plants can be a really stark comparison. So for our oak trees, they're supporting, depending on where you are in the United States, this is probably numbers for Massachusetts, they're supporting about 477 different species of caterpillars. The highest ranking flowering herbaceous plant are the goldenrods, and they're supporting about 131 different species of caterpillars. But for our non-native plants, it's a very different story. So on average, they support a lot fewer different species. So our ginkgo trees, which are a popular ornamental street tree, they're known to support 6. There's 6 species of caterpillars that are known to use that tree. Probably about half of them are non-native themselves. And for many of the popular plants that we can find at Home Depot, like hostas and zinnia and hyacinth and cosmos and marigolds, all of those popular plants that you're going to see as spring planting comes around, many of those are not known to support any caterpillar species at all. So when we import those, even if they have flowers, they're not really supporting those plant-eating insects. For a reason for that is that's part of the reason a lot of these plants were imported in the first place. But when we are importing things because we don't want pests on them, we're also inadvertently not supporting any of the plant-eating biodiversity that's out there, and it's having implications that we may not have realized when they were originally imported. One of the questions that I get a lot are whether it matters if we are planting species that are non-native but are closely related to our native species. So I call them non-native cousins. So an example of this would be the Kwanzan cherry, which is a Japanese cherry that's closely related to our native black cherry. or the Norway maple, which is an invasive maple that's closely related to our red and our sugar maples. And even though these non-native cousins are very similar to our native species in how they look, and sometimes in their timing, sometimes in the composition of the leaf, what we find is that they're not the equivalent of our native species at all. So when we make those close comparisons between native and non-native cherries and native and non-native maples, we see that the non-native cousins are supporting about 40% fewer caterpillar abundance and about 50% fewer species compared to those natives. So they're really not the equivalent to our native species. Another example of the impact of these non-native cousins that has been that gets overlooked when we just look at community level impacts is impacts that would happen to the individual caterpillar. And I had this really clever undergrad that was working with me last year, and he decided to do a feeding experiment with one of my favorite caterpillars, the Promethea moth, and he fed almost 1,000 caterpillars on 18 different species of native and non-native cherry trees, because he wanted to see how well that they grew. And what he found is if you force these caterpillars to eat non-native plants, that they suffer a higher mortality. So more of those individuals die during their growth cycle, and they also grow slower, and they eventually pupate in a smaller weight. And so some of my favorite kind of science is the kind where I don't need to show you any graphs at all. So this is a picture of two different caterpillars that were 40 days old. And you can see that on the left, the caterpillar that was raised on our native black cherry is in its final stage. It's almost ready to turn into a cocoon. It's nice and plump and probably delicious from a bird's perspective. But the caterpillar that was raised on the Yoshino cherry, another kind of Japanese cherry, was much smaller and still had a long way to go before it was able to grow big enough so that I could turn into its cocoon. So even if we do find caterpillars on these non-native cousins, we're finding that there's still negative consequences that happen at the individual level. So moving away from the caterpillars, the next question is really, do native plants provide better habitat for our breeding songbirds? And we have reason to think that they probably do if the native plants are supplying more food for them, but are the birds actually perceiving that? And I had a study on breeding songbirds, including the Carolina chickadee, as well as a few other common backyard birds in the Washington, D.C. area, where we looked at the natural the plant communities that were found in people's yards all around the Washington, D.C. area. And we wanted to see how well are these birds doing, what trees are they choosing, and how many young are they producing over the year. And what we found when we followed these Carolina chickadees around during the breeding season was that they overwhelmingly preferred native plants. So most of our observations of these birds foraging and looking for food was happening on native plants. They pretty much ignored the non-native plants, and the ones that they chose were ones that had more food on it. So if there was more food, it was a strong predictor of whether these chickadees would actually want to feed. So the birds aren't dumb, they're going where there's food. But the next question is really, are there consequences to these songbirds when non-native plants are abundant in the landscape? So if the bird doesn't have a choice of where to forage, if there's only non-native plants around to feed on, are there consequences that happen at the population level? And so we did a lot of field work studying these chickadees in nest boxes in hundreds and hundreds of yards, looking at whether the males got females and how many young did they have and how many eggs did they lay and how many survived. And what we found was that there was a pretty consistent pattern. Our strongest pattern was that our chickadees strongly preferred breeding in yards that had more native plants. So the higher the native plant biomass that was in that neighborhood, the more likely you were to get a chickadee actually come and visit, and the more likely you were to have a male that was actually able to attract a female so that he could have a nest. If those birds did breed in a yard, we found that when there were more native plants, those nestlings were growing faster and they were fledging the young earlier, which is great from a bird's perspective to get out in the world and not be confined to that small location. And ultimately, we found that these birds were fledging more young in yards that had more native plants as well. And we ran a bunch of simulations so that we could see if there was a threshold that would have the strongest impact at the population level for sustaining chickadee populations. And we found that the minimum amount of native plant biomass that was needed to sustain a stable chickadee population so that they're producing enough young to replace the ones that naturally die over the years. It needed to be at least 70% native plant biomass at a neighborhood scale. And so what that means is that for a lot of people in these areas, just planting a few more trees of native plants or starting to prioritize native shrubs in their landscaping could really make the difference in whether chickadees can have a stable population in that area or not. So we got some really strong results suggesting that native plants have a very strong positive impact on breeding songbirds, and especially the ones that rely on almost exclusively insects during the breeding season, like our chickadees. In addition to, so I've talked a lot about biodiversity, but in supporting wildlife, but I want to make sure that you also take home with you that planting native plants can have a lot of benefits that go beyond wildlife habitat. So in addition to sustaining pollinators and songbirds and other wildlife, these native plants are also providing important ecosystem services. We find that native plants are managing stormwater better, they store more carbon, they build healthier soil. Many native plants are extremely tolerant of our local ecosystems, even our novel ones in cities, and are adapted to a wide variety of different local conditions. And there's many native plants that also provide additional services that we might desire, such as food and medicinal properties as well. And finally, they're beautiful. You know, for every non-native plant that's out there that has some trait that you're really excited about, there's probably a native plant that can do that just as well. So when you get out and start looking at the many different choices that are now available for you, it's much easier than ever before to find these native plants that also support wildlife. For the last bit of this talk here, I just want to touch briefly on what kinds of native plants you might want to choose and whether there's groups of species that might be disproportionately important for supporting species interactions in your local area. And this is based on some research that we did looking at plant caterpillar interactions across the entire United States. Looking at both native and non-native plants, but for the purposes of this, native plants were always supporting more caterpillar species. But what we found is that about 14% of the native plants that are out there are supporting about 90% of the butterflies and moths that are out there as well. And so it turns out that there are a couple of, or more than a couple, there's a few dozen key species of trees and shrubs and flowers that really have the lion's share of supporting the most diversity that's out there. So this is an example of some of the species that are important in Missouri. So for our trees and shrubs, we have our oaks. Here's your numbers, 461 different caterpillar species. Our cherry trees, which also have wonderful fruit and for birds and pollinator flowers, supporting 355 different species, willows, birches, aspens. All of these trees are really great for supporting our butterflies and moths. And in our flowers and our herbaceous plants, they tend to support few diversity, but of course we need them in our ecosystems too. We want to have that structure and diversity. And the power players there are really the goldenrod at 118 species, asters at 92, strawberry at 65, and sunflowers at 84. And so these are real species that you can kind of get the most bang for your buck by intentionally including them in your landscaping. And this is pretty much true no matter where you are in the United States. So we did a full analysis of these networks across many, many different states across the United States. And we found that on average, here are the trees here, there were some trees that came up again and again as being really disproportionately important for supporting most of those 10,000 butterflies and moths that we can get in the United States. And for example, you'll see these oak leaves come up in a couple of different slides coming forward, because we found that on average, our oak trees, no matter where you are, if you're in Missouri or Massachusetts or Texas or California or Montana, oaks are on average supporting about 20% of the caterpillar diversity that's out there, which is much, much higher than most of the plant species that are in certain areas. And when we did our analyses, we looked at a lot of different things, such as how many species are they supporting? How many specialized species are they supporting? How stable is the food web? All kinds of fancy metrics. And we came up with about a dozen different trees and shrubs that we termed keystone species. So things like oaks and willows and cherries and pines, these are the trees that have the most impact on supporting species interactions. And we call them keystone species because, like the keystone in an arch, if you were to take them out of the ecosystem, you risk the collapse of the rest of the interactions in that ecosystem. It turns out that when we started looking at this idea of keystone plants for caterpillars, it got us thinking about, well, are there similar kinds of important plants that are happening in other species interaction networks? And that's really where my research has been going from this previous paper. And so I'm just going to touch briefly on whether there might be some for flowers, important flowers for supporting our bee populations. And this is some ongoing research. But we can look at plants for our specialist bees. So specialized bees are species that feed pollen from just a couple of different plants to feed their young, just like a bird feeds their baby birds, bees feed their baby bees. And our specialized bees will feed only particular pollen. And about 30% of our bees are plant specialists. And so and a lot of times in bees, it's like one plant to one bee, but we can add up which plants might be supporting more of those specialized species. And we can see a lot of the same plants come up. So again, we have goldenrods, 34 species, sunflowers, 34, asters, black-eyed Susans, coreopsis, blueberries, willows. And these ones with the star I'm pointing out as these were ones that were also really important in our plant caterpillar data set as well. So here we're getting even more bang for the buck because we're supporting our bee populations as well. We're starting to look at this in more detail. So that was based just on records of bees that are known to have preferences for certain plants. But up here in Vermont, we have a very tremendous data set of 20,000 bee plant interactions across the state from the wonderful folks that have been submitting data through iNaturalist. And we're starting to dig into this now to see if we can identify what are the plants that are really supporting the vast diversity of bees that are found across the state. And we still have a lot of quantitative work to do, but we can see that things like asters, goldenrods, and sunflowers, this plant family really lights up really bright. A lot of the plants that provide food for us, like blueberries, cranberries, and rhododendron, as well as legumes like our beans, are showing up really bright. And then things that we really like to plant in our gardens, like roses, cherries, and apples, are also showing up really bright. So we have a lot of work to do, but there's some encouraging evidence of that there probably are some plants that these bees are highly preferring over the many other plants that are out there in the landscape. Scientists are slow. Unfortunately, we have a lot more work to do in this area to help identify what plants are best for your bee populations. But if you're interested in getting more recommendations of native plants for your area and for the Midwest, specifically, the Xerces Society has a great list for bee-friendly plants for your area. And Cornell University has wonderful recommendations on their website for how to create a pollinator garden for native specialist bees that goes beyond just the plants, as well as providing nesting habitat as well. And then the last thing that I just want to talk about in the little bit of time that I have left is which plants might we want to plant for our birds, and whether there might be keystone species that are disproportionately important for supporting our bird populations as well. And again, there's much more work to be done in this area, but we're starting to see some relationships that suggest to us, not surprisingly, that when a plant supports a lot of food for birds, it also supports a lot of bird foraging and diversity as well. So this is another example from our chickadees, as well as our other common backyard birds. And we found that our foraging birds strongly preferred to feed on oak trees and other kinds of high insect producing trees. And in fact, we found that the number of caterpillar species that a plant supports in its local region was a really strong predictor for how well that, or how much that plant was preferred relative to other plants in the landscape. And so we see this wonderful linear relationship where the more caterpillar species that a plant supports, the more likely that bird is going to prefer it in its foraging behavior. And so this suggests that that number, that quantitative metric of number of caterpillar species is kind of a really nice proxy for how attractive or how valuable that plant might be for supporting species interactions. Another example where we found similar relationships is I had another student that had this really clever clay caterpillar experiment that he put out, where he put these fake caterpillars on trees and then he would visit them day after day to see when they were eaten. And what he found is that it didn't matter what season you were in, whether it was spring, summer, or fall, oaks were always, caterpillars were always eaten quickest, and a higher proportion of caterpillars were eaten in oaks relative to other trees that support a very low diversity of caterpillars, like our tulip trees. And so that suggests that across the bird community, beyond just our backyard birds, that birds are foraging more often in these oak trees relative to other trees that are in a forest. And so building off that, for the last couple of years, I've been studying migratory birds that are using urban forests and other green spaces so that they can find food in order to refuel to make their migratory flight. So every time birds are flying south for the winter or coming back north in the spring, they need to find places so that they can find food, so that they can bulk up with that fat in order to make these high endurance flights. And they end up in places like our parks and our yards and our cemeteries and our golf courses. And so we did this really cool study where we looked at these species like Blackburnian warbler and black-throated green warbler and northern parula warbler and blackpoll warbler. Can you tell that I like warblers? We looked at a bunch of warblers and we found that when oak trees are really abundant, that these migratory birds are in better nutritional condition as well, that they were refueling at higher rates and were able to stay for a shorter period of time. And so this suggests that if you're planting your yard with native species, and especially those high insect producing native species like oaks and cherries, you're not just supporting your local breeding birds like cardinals and chickadees, you're also supporting a tremendous diversity of migratory species that you might never see breeding in your backyard, but you're providing a really essential habitat for them for just a few days during the year so that they can make these amazing journeys up to Canada. And so again, we have a lot of work to do in this area, but we have enough information to suggest to you that is worthwhile for you to create this habitat for migratory birds. And I would encourage you to think about cultivating these habitat highways whenever you can, especially when you think about what you're going to plant this spring. From including insect-friendly native plants, also increasing habitat and reducing lawn. You can do things like keeping shelter, like snags and woody debris piles so that birds have places to hide, avoiding pesticides whenever possible, and of course, reducing the hazards of your yard as well, because we don't want to attract birds into an area to forage only to have them encounter outdoor cats or windows that they might run into. So we want to try to make our yards as safe as possible so that when they stop at your rest stop, they can continue to make their migratory journey. So that's most of the information that I have for you today, but just to finish up here, I hope that you've taken home with you that planting native plants is an incredibly valuable decision that you can make to support biodiversity. So I encourage you to find native plants in your area. Here are a couple of websites that you can use to help make your decisions. But I'm sure there's going to be a lot of wonderful information in the next upcoming webinars to help you find more local resources as well. I also encourage you to go out and meet your neighbors. So one of the resources that scientists have been using for their data is this wonderful website called iNaturalist that you can visit. You can upload photos of bees or birds or insects that you find in your yard. And experts and enthusiasts all over the world will crowdsource identifications for you. So you can see this bee that I uploaded. I knew the genus, but I didn't know the species. And thankfully, somebody came in and identified it for me. So I encourage you to go out and meet, what kind of wildlife do you have in your yard? What would you like to encourage more of, and use this website to your advantage? And finally, that data is really useful. So we're actually using this so that we can provide a resource for people to use to select plants for bees and other pollinators in their gardens. So the more interactions that you upload to this website, the more information that we can have to provide the data that you need for your decision making. So that's all I have for you today. Hopefully you have some questions and I'm happy to answer them. And I hope that the most important thing that you take home with you today is that your yards and your gardens really matter for biodiversity. And by making those decisions like planting native plants, you can have far-reaching impacts on the rest of the biodiversity that's out there. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll take any questions that you have.
Thank you so much, Desiree. That was a really insightful and helpful talk to kind of center why this is an important topic to be considering when we're looking at our own yards. And we had a lot of comments, so thanking you for a wonderful presentation. And we've certainly had plenty of questions. So I'll start with well, first, let me just mention there were a lot of questions about specific species and things like that. Some of that piggybacking off of what you had shared about our region, and we definitely have talks coming up about how to what kinds of native trees and shrubs work in our area. So that's coming up shortly, and I'll have a link in the chat here if you haven't registered for that talk yet and want to, you can. And then also the resources that we'll be sharing and will be coming up during this this next 5 weeks about the Partners for Native Landscape resources, and the partners themselves. They often share Grow Native plant database, for example. The library's put together a LibGuide to help people kind of explore the resources out there. Partners for Native Landscaping has their own resource guide, all places to look for the kinds of things that grow native in Missouri and in St. Louis. So so some of those questions we may not get to tonight since we're just getting started, and there's plenty of opportunity to research and hear more about it coming up. But as far as your talk specifically, there were some questions about, we often have questions about pollinators, and so the butterflies are always a particular popular topic. So people are concerned, for example, about how to have a garden in harmony. As we talked about, some of the plant choices were because plants were being eaten and not necessarily pleasant to look at or difficult to maintain with the caterpillar and other insect activity. So we had a question about whether or not having natural plantings or the kinds of host plants, I guess, that that butterflies like, for example, the one you highlighted, the milkweed plants. If those are close to your other kinds of vegetation in your garden, your vegetable garden, for example, is that something that can create other problems if they're planted too closely, bringing other things in, maybe, since we know that the caterpillars aren't eating like tomato plants, but are other things that they attract? Does proximity play a role, I guess, is the real question.
Sure. So in terms of proximity, in many cases, having natural native plant garden near your vegetable garden can actually be really beneficial, because while most of the native plant eating insects are going to stay on their particular host plant, they're also attracting predators in. And there's been some studies that the more structural diversity that you have, so that's a fancy way for saying you have lots of different heights and lots of different species of plants, that's going to attract a lot of those beneficial predators like those ground beetles and those spiders. And those are what's going to be helpful for your vegetable garden. So there are recommendations from people that are super deep into permaculture about the best way to have these sort of vegetable gardens in harmony. And I would encourage you to seek out those sort of resources to see what that might be. Most of the insects that go, buck wild on your vegetables are invasive species that were imported with non-native ornamental plants. So the import of non-native plants is not just that it has transformed our plant communities, it also is the gateway for invasive insects that transform lots of different things, such as our economies and our agriculture and everything. And so, like Japanese beetles and there's some like cabbage worms, those are all mostly invasive species. And so what you want to do is try to maximize the beneficial predators that can help take care of them for you, because the native caterpillars that are on the goldenrod are never going to eat your lettuce because they can't. They literally can't process it. And you also were bringing in the birds too, right? Those birds are gonna help out. And there was a wonderful study on organic farms in Massachusetts that found that when they were more plant diverse, structurally diverse organic farms, there were more birds, and that was providing more top-down pest control on the actual crops.
That's the sort of thing I find so fascinating and compelling. All the ways that when we encourage the ecosystem to function the way it was designed to, that it is self-regulating to a great extent, which is hard to unlearn. All the things we've been told make for a good yard over the decades. So that leads me to another question. Was we get a lot of questions about pest control, and I will say that we have a panel at the end of the whole webinar series on April 5th about pest control. But is there a possibility for there to be a coexistence between someone specifically asked about pre-emergent granular weed killers? Are there ways that those things can coexist with the ecosystem in our gardens, in particular the caterpillars and insects?
The question, is it okay for me to use pesticides sometimes?
We always get that question.
Yes. Okay. So here's the thing. There's a reason that when I put my slide on, I didn't say no pesticides. I said avoid pesticides. And that's my encouraging of you to think more sustainably and more conservatively about how pesticides are used. So let me say first off that if you're using insecticides, no insecticide is specifically targeted. So if an insecticide kills caterpillars, it kills all caterpillars. That means butterflies too. If an insecticide kills flies, it kills all flies. So we want to try to avoid insecticides whenever possible. Herbicides can also have unintentional consequences. But, you know, with the caveat being that I'm not an expert in using pesticides, they can be used in a very constrained, spot controlled method to try to minimize the amount of spillover that might have on the rest of the ecosystem. So for example, if you're having a lot of crazy trouble with your bittersweet and trying to get it under control, the very smart targeted use of pesticide might be what helps you finally get over the edge and have a healthy native ecosystem down the road. So I guess this is my way of saying that whatever pesticide or herbicide that you're thinking about using, look it up, read up on what the negative consequences might be, reach out to your extension office and talk to them about sustainable pest management methods and how you can take steps in addition to using the herbicide to help reach your goals. So don't just rely on that as, you know, well, this is the only thing I can do. Many times it's the easiest thing to do. So it may be that you have to put a little bit more work in, but that'll help keep the amount of chemicals that you're putting out into your property. We want to minimize the amount of chemicals. The other point that I want to make, and I guess this sort of goes back to insecticides as well, is that many folks, we've been socialized to think that if there are a little bit of bite marks on a tree, that tree is bad, or that tree is sick, or that tree is dying, or something is terrible. But truthfully, that tree is alive. That tree is supporting life. We need to also learn that and come to accept that though that little bit of herbivory is really not a big deal. Like the tree is going to live in many cases. And if we can tolerate that and appreciate what that is supporting a rich community of life. And so without going on too much of a tangent, that's my answer to the pesticide question.
A great answer, Kylie. So I'm trying to sift through the next logical direction to take this. And I think there were some interesting questions about hybridization. Someone asked first if you've studied nativars.
Oh, yes. Oh, this was the question.
Oh, this is the slide.
This is the slide. So sometimes I have this slide in here and sometimes I take it out. And this was one of the talks that I took it out. So we have studied nativars or native cultivars. So it turns out that when you go to a nursery, many of the plants that are available for sale are either non-local genetic stock. So they've come from somewhere else, mostly the Midwest, we're up here. Or they are specifically cultivated for traits like to be a dwarf variety, or to have more flowers, or to have pink flowers, or, you know, different kinds of traits. And so the question is, do these native cultivars, do they have the same ecological value? So we started to look at that with insects, and we had a paper published looking at caterpillars and leafhoppers and other plant-eating insects. And we found that we did direct comparisons between native wild type and cultivars for a bunch of different traits. And we found that for most traits, and we looked at disease resistance, fruit, dwarf, blah, all kinds of stuff, variegated. For most traits, there were no consistent negative impacts. The only trait where we found a consistent relationship of negative impacts is when trees were cultivated to have red leaves. So like it's a purple leaf redbud, or what is it called? Forest pansy redbud. It's a red-leafed variety of a redbud tree. Redbuds are supposed to be green. So when you change the leaf color, it has more red, it has more of those anthocyanins. That changes the chemistry of the leaf, which deters insects from using it. That makes perfect sense. So the more that you're altering that internal chemistry, the more likely you are to have negative effects. There's still a lot that we need to learn. I'm actually trying to get money right now to find out whether if we import there's a term called assisted migration, which is moving southerly trees farther north. So I'm trying to get money so that we can look at whether that impacts species interactions. Hopefully I get that money so I can answer that question for you, because truthfully, we don't know. And the folks that look at cultivars with bees and other flower visiting insects, it gets much more complicated. Often it's on a cultivar by cultivar basis. So it means that we need the people that are making the cultivars to value biodiversity when they are breeding them in the first place.
Wonderful, thank you. And the kind of dovetails into another kind of question along those lines, where we've had trees that are taken out from blight. So an example someone offered in the chat was the American chestnut. They were really hit hard by blight, and so there have been some, I guess, some hybridization with the Chinese chestnut. So it sounds like those kinds of things would the effectiveness of being able to kind of help native populations survive things might rely on those kinds of things you're talking about in the other studies.
Well, yes and no, in that the hybridization that you're talking about is a hybridization with a non-native plant. And in those cases, they're probably more likely to have negative consequences, because at that point we are bringing in more of that very different kind of leaf chemistry for a plant that's been adapted to another ecosystem. But in chestnuts in particular, there's the hybridization that's happening with non-natives, but then there's also the transgenic chestnuts. And in the case of elms, just selectively breeding disease-resistant elms. So that's really retaining native genetic stock. And that has more possibilities to be beneficial than something that's been hybridized with Chinese chestnut, for instance.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's
so complicated.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a very complicated world, and there are a lot, and we can do a lot of things. And it's interesting to think about the various factors that have where those might lead us. And thank you for doing the kinds of work that helps to make it clear for us out here trying to have more responsible, more supportive environments, our little mini environments that we have in our yards and our neighborhoods. And so let me come back to my list of what I've gathered from earlier. So here's a good question that will kind of, the resources we'll be talking about the next few weeks here, and the series will help to maybe solidify some resources. But a lot of us, we move into a home and we inherit the yard that's there. And any advice about how to go about figuring out what is invasive versus a native plant when we're trying to take stock of what we're working with?
Yeah. So that's an important question. It's tough. There's a lot of plants that are out there. A lot of local conservation groups, native plant societies, extension offices have lists, and in many cases have resources to help you identify invasive plants as well as their lookalikes. So I would encourage you to seek out those resources and really think about removing them first, right? Like, all of us are so busy. I just bought a house and I'm like, everything's breaking. I don't have, when am I gonna have time, right? So you have to triage. You have to think about, how can we make small steps towards getting to our ultimate goal? The first step is invasive plants. You want to get rid of them because they're gonna impede the rest of your progress. Once you're able to get a handle on them, then you can think about, well, what are the trees that are really non-native that, I don't really have any, I don't want them here. They're not doing anything for wildlife. And that's where working with, these conservation groups or these native plant societies, people love come out and help you. You could make a friend, they'll come out, they'll identify your plants, they'll say, this is a lilac, this is a hydrangea, you know. But and then the other I guess suggestion I would have is to take advantage of the iNaturalist program. So, you know, I have to be honest, when I was working on my PhD, we saw so many plants in people's yards. I went into one yard and I said, I can't figure out what this plant is. The guy's like, it's a jujube. Like, oh, the jujube. So it's hard because there's so many plants that are out there. And so I encourage you to, you know, find these resources, try iNaturalist, see if that can help you identify and hopefully that will help you make those steps. When you go to a native plant sale, people are always willing to share their information about, you know, they're not just what, you know, this is native and this is good for wildlife, but also this is good for shade. This is good for acidic soils. Those are the important things that you're probably going to be considering as well. So get in those networks and it's fun to learn.
Absolutely. And someone mentioned in the chat that our University of Missouri Extension Hotline can help with figuring out what plants might be invasive in your yard. We also have the St. Louis Audubon Society has the Bring Conservation Home program. I shared that in the chat that they can send somebody out to do a consultation. But this time of year, funnily, awesome. Yeah, they're a wonderful resource. In fact, my the assistant manager in my department last year used that service when she bought her new home. And so we have really great resources in St. Louis, but we are doing this month, and it'll be very busy. Just so folks know, you can I think get added to their wait list, and they'll be very helpful when they do come for a visit. And some of those folks will be talking with us in the next couple of weeks too. So. Yeah, thank you for that. And the iNaturalist is such a great resource for all kinds of things. So I shared the link to that too, if you're not familiar with it, with that, attendees, something to add to your iPad or your smartphone and play around with, and hopefully find some plants in your yard. So great resources that we can get to pretty easily. And there was an interesting question about some of the environments, not necessarily here in Missouri. We don't tend to have this issue, but in arid states where there's a lot of deserts and water conservation is an issue, people are, asked not to maybe aren't allowed to plant actual plants. So are native plants being considered as something that can be okay if they as people revise their approach to trying to conserve water in those areas?
Oh yeah. So so I have a lot of colleagues that work out of Arizona, and we had a lot of research in people's yards in Phoenix, and drought tolerant landscaping is very popular. It's also a very interesting social experiment as well, because it turns out that when you incentivize drought tolerant landscaping, but so native plants to Arizona are adapted to a drought tolerant ecosystem. So they would be the best the best suited to deal with having a very little water and will thrive in that environment. But what happened is many folks in Phoenix, they plant non-native South African plants because that's what it was available in horticulture. So a huge influx of non-native plants came into the ecosystems in Phoenix. The other things that folks do is we have been conditioned to think that green equals good. And so they take their drought tolerant landscaping and they put so much water on it that it doesn't function like a drought tolerant landscape at all, because the plants are always growing, they're always flowering, they're always doing lots of things. So that is a great example of thinking more about what is the natural ecosystem. I mean, our goal is never to replicate the desert, right? We are people. We have things that we need, like yards are always going to be novel, but we need to think really critically about what is appropriate for our ecosystem. Like, is throwing fertilizer all over our yards so that nitrogen is through the roof, probably a great idea. Or is planting a plant that can thrive in a low nitrogen ecosystem probably might be a better choice. So I'm going on a tangent, but in these droughts, so native plants can be really useful in the east for dealing with stormwater, in the west for dealing with drought, and they also will thrive without watering them as they're supposed to. But in these drought tolerant landscapes, we can also think about, there are other ways that you can support wildlife that goes beyond planting plants as well. So some people have created water sources so that little oases for birds to come visit, or nest boxes, or places to hide. Like, that structure can be super important so that a bird can hide if there's a predator around. So those are all kinds of other things that we can do, but I encourage us to really appreciate and learn more about what is our local ecosystem supposed to be like when we're thinking about how we might want to landscape, so that we can minimize our resources. That makes it easier for everybody. Let's just be lazy.
Like, yeah, lazy, that's my kind of landscaping in general.
Mine too.
So I think that a lot of the questions that I think I haven't touched on are really more specific to kinds of plants and that sort of thing that might work well. And I think in those instances, I would direct everybody to the resources we've shared this evening. And hopefully you'll come back and join us for some of the programs coming up, where we're able to spend a little more time just focused on trees and shrubs or the invasive plants in our yard. So we'll have time for more of those in-depth questions coming up. So thank you everyone for your great questions in response to a wonderful and very informative presentation. Desiree, we had a lot of comments thanking you for sharing your passion and your knowledge with us, and kicking off this next 5 weeks of learning a little more because of the in-person day on April 15th. But we have a lot of opportunities to really dig into native landscaping and what that means for us here in St. Louis and the region at large. And if you're joining us from elsewhere, so glad you did. And you can see from what the information Desiree shared with us this evening that there are a lot of resources we can grab from wherever we are, and a lot of things we can think about wherever we are to have native landscaping as part of our consideration when we're looking at the environment around us. So thank you again. I will share in the chat in just a moment the survey one more time, but thank you so much, Dr. Narango, for being with us. This was a wonderful way to kick off the webinar series. We really appreciate your time this evening.
Thanks for the invite. This was fun. Thanks,
Wonderful.
everyone.
And by the way, you had a compliment on your chickadee pin, which I didn't see earlier, and it is so cute.
Thank you. You're the first person to ever notice.
Yes, great job, whoever brought that to my attention. Thank you for very observant audience. But yes, thanks everyone. And I'll leave the chat open here for a moment so you guys can grab any links that you need from what I shared. Otherwise, we'll see you soon. Take care, everybody. Thank you so much.